Today on Locked On Dolphins, we're exploring the short-term pressure that the Dolphins' brain trust may feel and how to balance that out against the long-term outlook of building a team that's still set up for success.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, and the NFL Draft lead for the 33rd team. I want to give a special shout out and welcome to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it. Here on the Locked On Network. Today on the show, we are looking at short-term pressure versus long-term picture, which is not an easy thing to simultaneously have to balance. And I think a lot of Dolphins fans, it's very easy to make a lot of assumptions about what that means and what that looks like for this offseason for the team, with kind of the low-hanging fruit and presumptive understanding being that this team is going to not move on from Tyreek Hill, and potentially if Terron Armstead wants to be back, they can hang on to Terron Armstead and not potentially making a transition with Bradley Chubb and keeping the nucleus of the team for one more go around. And we're going to do things differently with how we spend in free agency. But that coming at the cost of who do you restructure? What does that do for your future cap outlook? There's a way in which you can do this. But as I have sat down and I have started to kind of work through my versions of simulated off seasons where your objective is to try to get to the 53-man cut down after an entire simulated off season and then look at a 3-year cap health picture and snapshot after that, as far as what kind of restructure potential do you have and what's your starting point for salary cap versus the projected salary cap for 2026. As I have sat down and I have started to do this, is there a world in which you keep Tyreek Hill and you keep Terron Armstead and you keep Bradley Chubb and you restructure all three of those contracts, and then you restructure to the other $25 million of Tua Tagovailoa's base salary, and you keep the nucleus of the team together, and you restructure all your middle-class players, and maybe Zach Sealer gets a contract extension, but his salary cap number is probably going to go down as a result of that. You keep everything together, you try to add to it, and you just say, well, we got to win this year, so you might as well empty the chamber. Yes, that world can exist, but you are at what I think, in my opinion, is a tipping point where if you do it for one more year, the windfall off of that is going to be, even if you have success in 2025, the blowback off of that and the ramifications of that are not the snapshot of a healthy franchise in 2026. And it's kind of like the analogy being you're a team you're a coach and a GM that's on the hot seat, and you're entering into year 3, and you finally draft the quarterback in year 1 in a must-win year, with the hope being that it buys you the good graces to kind of continue to see things through, and you do a good enough job. For me, when I look at where the Dolphins are at in 2025, and this kind of all started with me, I sat down and Terron Armstead listened to his interviews over the weekend on Super Bowl Media and Radio Row, and hearing him talk and start to prepare yourself for him to make his decision. And if he chooses to come back, what does that look like? And you can make an argument just from in a vacuum. And I did this over on Touchdown Miami on Substack. I did the breakdown of here's what the cap ramifications are if Terron Armstead retires. Here's the cap ramifications if Terron Armstead is back and the Dolphins restructure his contract. They could save like $9 million in cap space. And then you could get out as a post June 1st for Terron Armstead in 2026 and save about the same amount of cap space. You just have to wait till June 2nd to get it. And it's at the expense of like $7.5 million more in dead cap in 2027. Here's what happens if Terron Armstead wants to play and the Dolphins move on and designate him as a post-June 1st departure. Here's what happens if the Dolphins decide to move on from Terron Armstead and they eat all of the dead cap up front and move on from him because they have Patrick Paul waiting in the wings to be the left tackle. And they think it's easier to maybe sign somebody in free agency who could play guard and tackle and can be a guard answer for you and simultaneously be the security blanket at tackle as your swing tackle. All of those different permutations, and I'm sitting here looking at them like, well, the dollars really make the most sense for Terron Armstead if he wants to play. You can generally perceive Keon Smith coming back off an injury. He's a restricted free agent. You could have him back for $1.03 million. Patrick Paul, Austin Jackson, Terron Armstead. You could look at that group of 4 tackles and say, you're probably pretty good there. Maybe we don't need that as a need this offseason. We can let that be. And that'll help you in 2025. But when you look at the entire picture of the entirety of the roster and Tyreek Hill's $52 million cap hit in 2026 and Tua Tagovailoa's cap hit of $56 million and Terron's 22 and Bradley Chubb's and Jalen Ramsey's 26, and you add all these things together and you ask yourself, even if you win in 2025, by deferring all the money on some of these guys now or not transitioning away from a few of these contracts, the blowback off of that is going to hurt the middle class of your roster next season and the season after that, as compared to who do you potentially have succession plans in place for? And how do you balance trying to win and be better in 2025 with a healthier long-term outlook? And that's the massive question. And that's the question that I want to get into with some of these big name contracts, because we've gone over what I think are the big 3 contracts to make decisions on. It's Tyreek Hill, it's Terron Armstead, it's Bradley Chubb. But I want to look at what the ramifications are of the 2026 exit ramps for those contracts if you keep these players in 2025, and what that means for your 2026 cap outlook, which is secondary to Mike McDaniel and Chris Grier. But I think probably the severity of which fans externally perceive the pressure is probably to some degree different than what they feel internally, having been a part of the conversations with Stephen Ross and understanding where this organization is at right now. And there is a way to compete through transition, but it probably is going to mean some unpleasant personnel decisions. So we're going to look at 2025 short-term costs versus 2026 and long-term health and benefits next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So make sure you guys stick with us. Football season may be over, but basketball is in full swing, and there's no better way to stay in the game than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With Prize Picks, you pick more or less than at least 2 player stat projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. You can download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. With code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. For example, you can look at Jason Tatum for more than 29 points. And the best part is Prize Picks. It's quick, easy. You can set your lineup in as little as 60 seconds. And their fast and secure withdrawals mean you get your winnings in as little as 15 minutes. So download the app today. Use code LOCKEDONNFL. Get $50 instantly after you play that first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. So I have my own personal bookkeeping, because sometimes with the salary cap tools that exist, whether that's over the cap or Spot Track or whoever else. There's some discrepancies as far as classifying post-June 1st cuts as in the window of pre-June 1st and accounting for roster bonuses that are due and prorate out. But if you move on from a player before they get paid, it changes numbers. Not a math guy, though. Don't let me tell you I'm a math guy. But just want to use Bradley Chubb as an example. The first example of these big three contracts and a few others that we're looking at. Bradley Chubb is due just short of $19.5 million in base salary in 2025. That's cash owed to him. His salary cap hit is just over $28.6 million. Now, you can restructure this contract and knock this down by almost $14 million. You can get it at 15.1. But the blowback off of that is Bradley Chubb's additional deferred money puts Miami more in debt against future years of cap by about $5 million over the next several seasons per year. And then if you move on from Bradley Chubb, all of that money accelerates into the next year, or you have to wait until June 2nd to get it. And it really, if you do that enough times, it renders your first and second waves of free agency as completely useless. So your restructure savings for Bradley Chubb is about $14 million in cap space. The Dolphins could do that today and get compliant against the cap. With their 49 players under contract, you need 51 when it's all said and done. So they might be just a touch. Once they add to 51, they might be a touch under the cap, but really cap compliant just off of that move in and of itself. The other side of the coin is if you were to move on from Bradley Chubb in the next month, you're going to waive Bradley Chubb. Say, well, we're not going to, do this song and dance for another year with the injury issues that exist. The savings to do that would only be about $1 million in cap space. The rest would be dead cap from all future years of money that he's already been paid, accelerating up into this year against the cap. But the Dolphins would save $29 million in cap space in 2026. That is the kind of move that we're talking about here. What kind of unpleasant personnel decision to create a need on your roster are you willing to do to create effectively your entire operating cap for what you're going to have this year once you do all the restructures and maybe you eat a big contract or maybe you eat two big contracts. But that will totally change the outlook of like what next year and what 2026 can look like. And again, I understand the team will feel some level of pressure to perform and be a better football team now than they were last year. But you have to ask yourself, are you in the talent allocation business or are you in the team building business? Because I think those things are not always mutually cohesive. Sometimes they can be mutually exclusive, where building a better team might result in having less talent allocated on your roster. And I think that can be applicable with, say, number 10. And let's just use him as the next example. So for Bradley Chubb, it was you can restructure and save about $14 million in cap space. Or you can lop off, take your medicine, eat a large dead cap figure, and you can open up $29.341 million in cap space in 2026 to move on from that singular player for 2026 cap outlook. Tyreek Hill. There's reports suggesting that the Dolphins are going to stay the course with this thing and that he's expected to be with the team. And part of me expects that to be factual, but the other part of me kind of thinks this is some public posturing for if they're going to get offers to give the impression that they're not just going to give him away. right? We're not doing a fire sale with Tyreek Hill. But when rubber meets the road, we'll see what decision they ultimately make. And they have until September 1st to make that decision. Now, I think the argument that you could make here is if you were going to move from Tyreek Hill and you were going to do this thing that we're talking about, this unpleasant taking of medicine, if you traded Tyreek Hill before June 1st, theoretically, if you traded him during draft weekend, you a receiver's there that you like, and it opens the door for you to potentially trade Tyreek Hill. This is, again, these are all hypotheticals. I'm not saying any of this is actually happening. You'd lose about $600,000 in cap space versus what he's currently scheduled to be on the books for. So it's a 28 point, effectively $3 million dead cap hit. But doing that opens $52 million in cap space in 2026. Versus if you restructure Tyreek Hill, you could, in theory, open up what's equal to another $7 million in cap space in 2025. But now his salary cap hit for 2026 goes up to $54.6 million, and you've deferred another $9 million of that into future years, which means you have to account for another $7 million in dead cap if you were to move on. And you're certainly not going to keep him on the roster with a $54 million cap hit when he's owed what's going to be equal to $35 million in cash in 2026. It's not going to happen. So you already have an understanding that like the wall is looming with your expiration date for Tyreek Hill based off the way his contract is currently structured. Do you cling on for one more year with the hope and the pray that it all goes well and Tyreek's happy the entire year and it doesn't go nuclear just for you to move on after 2025 anyway? Or do you say, maybe we can make this transition now and get something for this player and free up a monumental amount of salary cap space in 2026 to reset our books? Terron Armstead is the same thing, where Terron Armstead, you can kind of go down the rabbit hole and say, well, if Terron Armstead wants to play, I mean, the easiest thing that could happen for Miami is he decides to retire. Because then the ball is out of your hands. You don't make the decision. You say, okay. We can process it post June 1st if we want to and split the dead cap amount. Or you can do the unpleasant taking of the medicine. And you could say, well, Terron Armstead, if you were to process his retirement or if you were to cut him before June 1st, or if you were to trade him before June 1st, you'd need $18.5 million in dead cap versus what is almost a $23 million cap number that he's on the books to play for the team this year. You could save about $4.25 million in cap space to move on from Terron Armstead, but you free up $22.14 million in 2026. So for this, in the last couple of years, it's been, oh, well, the Dolphins are such and such in the red and deficit against the cap to start. And then you do your restructures and you reset the deck and you defer the money to future years. And because it's interest-free loans against future years with an increasing salary cap, you can ride the wave with that and process through it. But this team-building ideology has always been about, you have succession plans in place to make hard, unpleasant decisions to transition away from certain players once it reaches a certain point, and then you can build for the next cycle. That's what Baltimore and Buffalo did last year. Those two teams, I use this as an example here on the other side of the break, but it has to do with dead cap because that's what we're talking about. You're talking about taking large dead cap hits to move on from a select player or two players so that you do not have the deferments in future years. Those players completely come off your book within the here and now. And as long as you have succession plans or you allocate succession plans for those players, what you can start to do is compete through the transition, take the unpleasant medicine, and then you'll get into next year's cap outlook, and suddenly you can be one of the top 10 teams in salary cap space without stripping down the entire roster and tearing the whole thing to the studs and having an awful year like the Dolphins had foundationally in 2019. But if you keep playing the game long enough that you're currently playing, something like that is more likely to be what your future holds. So you have some hard decisions to make. We're going to talk about succession plans. I want to make the point on dead cap that's coming your way next year on Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss opening tip-off or if you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment exciting, whether that's a late-game rally you're pulling for or picking a player to hit a clutch three. You never miss your chance on FanDuel. The app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. So NFL dead cap in 2024. Half of the teams that were in the top 10 in dead cap were postseason represented teams in this past season. And, you consider Stephon Diggs in Buffalo and trading Stephon Diggs for what ended up being a $32 million cap hit for the Bills. But the way that Buffalo is going to come out on the other side of it is a much more healthy, and they may make that unpleasant decision with Von Miller this offseason. Denver had $89 million in dead cap. They went 10-7, made the playoffs. Buffalo had $75 million in dead cap and went 13-4. Minnesota had over $70 million in dead cap. They went 14-3. Green Bay had 64.5. And they had the 7th most dead cap in the NFL. They went 11-6. Philadelphia won the Super Bowl, went 14-3. They had $63.6 million in dead cap. That was the 8th highest figure in the NFL. Tampa Bay went 10-7, won the NFC South. They had $62.499 million in dead cap. For accounting for cash paid in past years to players who are no longer on the team. The Chargers were 12th with 60.9. The Seahawks went 10-7, just missed the playoffs, had $58.3 million in dead cap in 2024. So playoff teams at 1, 3, 5, 7, 8, 9, and 12, all over $60 million in dead cap. So if that doesn't change your perception a little bit about dead cap and the ability to compete through it, I don't know what will. But that is the thing that I have the biggest, as I sit down and I look at what 2026 and beyond can look like. If you make all of these short-sighted decisions just based off of the pressure for 2025, you're going to start to put yourself down the path of, not to the same degree as the Browns and the Saints, who have had disproportionate cash flow and borrowing and deferments of cap payments. And New Orleans now is in like the bottom tier of cash spending across the league, but they're still in one of the largest deficits because of what they did for 5, 6, 7 years. I'm not saying that extreme is on the table for you. But what I am saying, even if it doesn't work out in 2025, I think if it doesn't, if it works out without a monumental breakthrough in 2025, you're going to put yourself back on the hot seat again. And if it doesn't work out in 2025, you will have even less of an argument for whatever extenuating circumstances you experience in 2025 if you completely mortgage 2026 and beyond for a 1-year bite at the apple because you feel pressure and everybody perceives the pressure. This is one of those ones for me. It goes back to process versus results. And I think the way that you best give yourself a sustained runway as Chris Greer and Mike McDaniel and the brain trust of the organization to continue to hold your job for a sustained period of time is to do the next right thing. And when you look at where this team is at and where you look at where there are succession plans in place, you can make an argument there's some succession plan at edge, although you have Jalen Phillips on an expiring contract and you played the vast majority of this past year without Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb anyway. I don't think you had a lot of long-term answers there. But the presence and emergence of Chop Robinson does give you the argument to say, hey, maybe we have a clearing to transition away from Bradley Chubb because of the presence of Chop Robinson. Maybe you look at the play in 300 snaps of Patrick Paul and you say, well, Patrick Paul gives us our succession plan at offensive tackle. Let's take our medicine. We can free up $4 million in cap space for Terron Armstead. And then we can free up $22 million in cap space in 2026 from moving on from Terron Armstead as a pre-June 1st decision that we make in 2025 while trying to assemble the best team and not just hoard talent regardless of the blowback off of that. And I'm not going to sit here and advocate for the Dolphins to move on from all of the big three contracts that I think are your influx players a little bit. That's Tyreek Hill, Bradley Chubb, and Terron Armstead. But if you did, I'm just saying, if you did, you could move on from all three pre-June 1st, and you would only save about $4.5 million in cap space. Now, that is not a lot of cap space, but it's also equivalent to effectively two Aaron Brewer-sized contracts based on how they structured the Aaron Brewer contract when they signed it. Aaron Brewer was on the books against the cap for less than $3 million in 2024. It's an excellent signing. Right. But if you moved on from all three, you'd save, and I'm not a math guy, but I could break the calculator out here just to have the conversation about the ramifications of resetting the deck. And I'm not saying this is the right thing to do, but this is the larger point. Bradley Chubb would be $29.3 million in cap savings for 2026 if you took the medicine in 2025. Tyreek Hill would be $51.89 million in additional cap space in 2026 if you moved on from him and took your medicine in 2025 and effectively did the break even against the cap. And then Terron Armstead would be an additional $22.1 million of cap space. You are talking about $103.29 million in cap space for 2026. For those three players, if you take your medicine this year, you could use whatever combination you want. You know, Bradley Chubb and Terron Armstead. If you keep Tyreek Hill, you're talking $51 million in cap space. If it's Bradley Chubb and Tyreek Hill that you move on from, it's $80 million in cap space and change. If it's Tyreek Hill and Terron Armstead, it's $76 million in cap space. You know what I mean? So is there a combination of those three players, any or all, that you individually, and I can't answer this for you, that you feel comfortable with based off what's currently on the roster to press forward with without that big contract and still give yourself a chance to compete and be successful in 2025? Because the easy thing to do is to look at those players and say, well, they're good players. We should keep them all and restructure them and get salary cap compliant and add around it as best as we can. And you could have about $38 million in operating cap at the start of the league year if you chose to do that. And that's even without getting into Tua Tagovailoa's contract at all. So you could have even more than that if you wanted it. But the deferment and the rigidity that causes for 2026, I think paints you into a corner that would put you back on the hot seat sooner rather than later. Because let's be honest, this team's probably not winning the Super Bowl in 2025. There's lots of things that could happen that I think could define the season as a success regardless. But the probability of that coming to pass for the team, you're one of 31. There's teams that are better positioned for starting points to get better and are starting ahead of you. Now you can have winning season, and depending on what happens, you got to play the games. You could win the division, you could have a home playoff game, you could win a playoff game. I think all those things would make it a successful season and would alleviate the pressure that externally feels like it is all bearing down on the organization. But at what cost, if you do it, do you not just put yourself back on that hot seat again? And that's where it comes down to me, process versus results. And we can chase a better result and still have good process. But that means in some ways having less allocated talent as established NFL talent and instead focus on the building of the team. I don't have the answers. I have my opinions, and we'll continue to dive into them across this next month before the league year starts. But that's going to do it for us here today on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the show. You can come back, see us again tomorrow, and keep it locked in. Your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm Kyle Krabs, and I'm out of here. Go Fins.